Hey, this is Chris. In this video, I want to talk about reconstructing my Christian faith or coming back to the Christian faith after leaving as a teenager. And that happened in my mid 20s. I've already talked about in other videos my experience of growing up in fundamentalist Christianity. I've shared a video about my leaving fundamentalist Christianity. And now I want to talk about coming back and what led me to come back and why I came back. I did share in my earlier video how there were just so many questions that the fundamentalist tradition couldn't answer for me in my mind, and I was struggling with a lot of things. And I kind of slowly got drawn away from the church into unbelief and living in a way that was not acceptable in the tradition I was brought up in, so much so that I was seen as on my way to hell, and I believed I've lost my salvation. So to me, it was, I have no shot. If I'm going to go to hell, I might as well live it up on the way going. Kind of trying to figure out whether I was atheist, agnostic, trying to understand too, as I was going through that phase, is trying to understand all these different religious texts out there. When you grow up in kind of this fundamentalist circles, they don't really encourage you to read books like the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or other religious texts to try to explore different ways of looking at the divine, of creation, of human purpose, like the Eightfold Path in Buddhism. So as I was in the military and I was overseas and in Asia, in the Asia Pacific region, being introduced to a whole bunch of other belief systems, doing joint military missions with countries that had Muslim, Buddhist, Shinto, all these other belief systems, it was kind of an eye-opener for me to see all these different people and very good people, people that I admired and respected, having all these different belief systems and being able to reconcile that with the very exclusive nature of the fundamentalism that I grew up in. And Christianity, like many religions, are exclusive. We are the ones that know God and have a relationship with God, and the other religions are false. And at the time, I really had trouble reconciling that with what I saw in people in their lives. I was also further, the party life led to more dependence on alcohol. I gave up drugs going into the military. But then when I was overseas and struggling with depression, codeine was a legal substance in the country I was in. So I started mixed codeine with alcohol, and that had a real effect on just kind of numbing me to the world around me, because I just could not come to grips with leaving. Basically, I was leaving my faith. I was leaving not only my faith, but I was walking away from my family's beliefs. Even though I was really close to my grandfather, and this is going to play in just a minute, who was not a fundamentalist, and he was a Christian. It had a profound impact on my life, but he was not a fundamentalist. So having interactions with him over the years, that's going to play in just a minute, but it was a hard time to try to reconcile. It's just emotionally tearing, trying to leave a tradition, having doubts about it, saying, I can't believe this, I can't do this anymore. And then at the same time, not really knowing what to believe, not really able to live with the tensions in the world. And I might step back. I didn't say this in the earlier videos, but one of the things that I had also that I didn't remember in the earlier video, but remembered, just was remembering as I was getting ready for this one, When I was younger as a child, they did this kind of educational testing, and back then they did IQ testing. So my measured IQ came back as 160, which meant that I was extremely gifted and I was put in gifted classes and things like that. But I also had very severe ADD. And if you know anything about attention deficit disorder, that can really have a profound impact, even if you have a lot of intelligence. You kind of derail yourself with ADD. And I was that typical underachieving smart kid. My parents were frustrated, but they didn't want to treat the ADD because they felt like that was all just psychological mumbo jumbo, that it wasn't anything real. They didn't want me labeled. So the underperformance at school related to the intelligence that I was supposed to have had was to be whipped with a leather belt whenever my grades or my performance didn't meet standards. And again, that just goes in with this fear thing. So, but having these deeper thoughts, these more reflective thoughts that were always part of my life, that was kind of tormenting to me. So to have to resolve these things, to want to, maybe if I could only just be just simple-minded enough just to believe this stuff and not have all these questions, but that just wasn't where I was at. So I just had a whole mess going on, and I tried to work through some of these issues and realize that when it gets right down to it, between theism and atheism, that there is at some point a matter of faith. At some point, you just have to believe something. At some point, it's hard when we live in the world of molecules and atoms and physical stuff that's measurable, to talk about some existence that isn't material, because we can't see it, we can't measure it. We might be able to feel, and many people feel like they can observe it and see it, but you can't quantify it. You can't reproduce things. You can't, in other words, the spiritual can't be tested in a laboratory. So here I am thinking, okay, I've got to decide whether there's a God or not. I need to decide if this God, this divine being, has a self-consciousness, has a will, is a person, so to speak, or is this God, this divine being, energy? Is there something behind the physical world that I can't explain? And what about the world that I experience? How do I account for it? How do I explain it in ways that are intelligible to me, or something that can be acceptable to me? And kind of what I ended up doing and how I got there. And some people are going to argue and just say, "No, what about this philosophical argument? What about that philosophical argument?" I was a military guy, a kid in his early 20s that's thinking through all this stuff. I had a high school education. I hadn't gone to college. I tried to read as much as possible, look at things from different perspectives. But this is just me and my thoughts and what I'm working through, and I couldn't really think, and I was really struggling with, if you take away space and time, the physical world, there's time. We mark time by seasons, by the planet going around the sun. Space is a reality, even though we might not be able to see it, but there's nitrogen, oxygen mixed with other atoms, circulating in the air. So space is full of things, and even thinking about beyond this planet, beyond gravity, what was out there. You have space and you have time, and yet is there something that exists independent and apart from space and time? If so, it would not be part of the physical world. There had to be some other yet unknown substance or subsistence or something that God would be, if God exists. And if that's true, then there's no way to really measure God, to take God apart in the laboratory. And that became kind of, for me, it was like, yeah, there could be a God. It could not be that this God exists in any kind of measurable form, and that could account for the beginning of physical matter if this God had that power. I know these are simplistic arguments. If you're an atheist or agnostic, you've heard these before. The prime mover, the first mover. Uh, the way a lot of Christians said it is God spoke it and bang, it came into existence, kind of the play on the Big Bang. But for me, that was kind of what I began to say, that there had to be some kind of prime mover behind the existence of physical matter, because I couldn't see impersonal physical matter without some kind of self-consciousness and will somehow just existing eternally, or conceive of a nothing, a vacuum where there was no space and no time, and all of a sudden there was an explosion that resulted in matter and space and time and all those things. And for me, I just couldn't resolve that. So I said, yeah, there's probably a God. I believe that there's God. And then the next question is how can this God be knowable? How do you account for the world the way it is? And then with creation and evolution, I said, well, maybe there's a God that has created things, and in some way, somehow, is kind of guiding its development, and maybe the evolutionists are right, and maybe theism is right too, that there's a God and that there's not necessarily this contradiction. So I think, eventually I got to the point where I would say I believed in God. And even during this time too, one of the ways non-Christian people like me want to keep Christian proselytizing away from myself is I grew up in the tradition. So I knew what to say to get people to leave me alone, because I realized very early on that most Christians don't really care about the people they're trying to share the gospel with or trying to lead to faith. They're just trying to fulfill an obligation. So there was no real heart behind it. And I knew that growing up, that there was not really a concern other than being a soul winner. So I knew that if I gave the Christian answer, yeah, don't look at my life, just look at me. I'm saying I believe in Jesus, I'm good. And people would just go away, because there was not really that concern for me as a person among most Christians. The other thing that I learned is when you use the Christian lingo, when you need things in your life, and I know many people are like this. I've experienced this as a pastor, where you can move in and out of the church. You can move into the church community because those people are genuine and caring when you come into their midst and share needs and everything. And so you can get things that you need at various points in your life by kind of drifting in and out. So that was kind of my life. I was using the Christian faith for my advantage when I needed to, and I was pushing people away on the other side of it. But here I was coming to grips with this, and then reading other religious texts and everything, I began to really wrestle with how do you know which religious texts were written by people who really apprehended something significant about the divine, about God, and which religious texts were just figments of people's imagination. Because one of the things a lot of people say, well, all religions are basically the same. I would say, no, they're not. They're very different. If you read the text themselves, the sacred texts of different religions, they're mutually exclusive. They're not all basically the same thing. There's very largely contradictory ideas about God, the world, the purpose of humanity, creation of humanity, all those things. And so as I was working through that kind of stuff, I was realizing that you can't say all religions are basically the same. And how do you evaluate what these different writers of sacred texts are writing about encountering the divine? And which ones can you believe, which ones could you not believe? Maybe you don't believe any of them. Maybe one of them, one of these sacred texts really does have some insight into connecting and knowing God. So I was working through all those things. And when I came home from overseas in the military, I was about 24 years old. My grandfather, who was the Christian, who was what's called Reformed and Evangelical, he was an elder in a congregational church. He had his fourth stroke when I came back. I've been very close to him. He'd been very influential in my life. And he was now coming to the end of his life. And so my aunt and I were trying to be the ones that be there for him, help take care of him, recognizing, my grandmother and her needs. And I would go visit him in the hospital. He kept saying he wanted to go home. He wanted to go home. Then he's losing consciousness at that time. We transitioned. Back then I wasn't a hospice nurse. I didn't know any about this stuff. And so he was in and out of consciousness. And one day I was in the hospital seeing him, and it was at that point where we really didn't expect any kind of conscious interaction from him. But he became very conscious, very lucid, and turned to me and just started to beg me to turn to God. And I didn't know how to take it. I was there to comfort him, to be there for him, and at the end of his life. And that kind of rattled me a little bit, I would admit. And so he passed away, and then I go to this funeral, and again, he was part of a Reformed evangelical congregation. And I heard at the funeral a gospel message, or the proclamation of the gospel, that was very, very different than what I had heard growing up. Instead of a very fear-based, instead of a very, you've got to work hard to keep your salvation, viewing God as judgmental and looking for you to mess up so he could send you to hell because he takes pleasure in your judgment. I heard things like grace and mercy and compassion of God. I heard in this message that God loves and takes no pleasure in the judgment of the wicked. I heard that that there was a call to faith, to believe in Jesus, and there was but just the way it was presented, it was so different from what I grew up in. Instead of kind of the anger and the fear and the judgmentalism, there was more of an appeal to the heart, a recognition too that salvation is a work in the heart between God and a person. And that there is hope, and that there's nobody so bad or so wicked either to lose their salvation or to not get salvation, to be reconciled and right with God. So I heard this message, and with all the things that are swirling in my heart over the last several years, I don't know why it struck me so much. but probably a few weeks later, maybe, I was driving to the base where I was stationed down the highway, and I just became overwhelmed with this sense, this overwhelming internal compulsion that I couldn't explain. I started crying and crying out to Jesus, say, save me, Jesus, save me. My life is hopeless, it's miserable, just save me, take me out of this. I don't want to be in this anymore. Just save me. I'm sorry for what I've done. I'm sorry for my unbelief. I can't remember all the things, for all the bad things I've done. I just confessing and saying, save me. And that really marked a decisive change in my life. But the thing that happened after that is I didn't know any other kind of Christianity other than what I was raised in. And I didn't know that my dad had basically left fundamentalism and was more of a broadly evangelical pastor. And so I went back to the kind of church that I grew up in. And the pastor of that church actually had known my dad and known our family for years. So I started to attend that church. And I guess he figured out when I kept coming back in and week out, feeling yet again, there was very sharp distinction between this pastor at my grandfather's funeral, his pastor, and this church, again, feeling the weight of judgmentalism, feeling the weight of the burden of kind of keeping myself saved, this burden of you've got to perform, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. God's looking for reasons to kick you out of heaven. If you don't watch it, you're going to get judged, you're going to lose your salvation, all those kinds of things. So I'm hearing that, and it's a burden, but I'm going to keep at it because I felt like something in my life had changed. But after, I don't know, 8-10 Sundays going to this church, the pastor asked if he could see me. And again, I knew this guy growing up. When I was a little kid, he was a teenager. He's probably 13, 14 years older than me. Anyway, so I go and meet with him, and he said, Chris, I think you need to leave the church. And I was just shocked and floored. Here I am trying to seek after God. And I asked him why. He said, we don't want the young people in our church to think that they can go out living like you've lived and just come waltzing back to Jesus. And I was just floored. I'm getting kicked out of a church because of my past life and the fact that he knew what it was, because my dad was a pastor and he knew our family and knew how I'd gone off the rails. And he just said, you need to go, because our young people, if they see you coming back to Jesus after doing what you've done, then they maybe think it'd be okay for them too. Basically I was destroying the fear. It was a counter witness to the fear they were engendering in those kids. So I didn't know what to do. So I called my dad and I asked him, where do I go from here? And my dad gave a very surprising answer. And in fact, I'm going to talk about that in the next video, about my journey back into the Christian faith, because he did something that so rocked my world and was so unexpected that I just was like, whoa, this goes against everything you brought me up to believe about Christianity when I was younger. But it was good and it was necessary and it was very wise spiritual advice. So I'll share that in the next video as I talk about reconstructing and rebuilding a Christian faith that was much more healthier spiritually than the fundamentalism that I grew up in. So God bless. Have a good day. Thanks.